All right, we're back with the LinnFit Coaching Podcast, and I'm here with Matt Donovan today. And so we are here to talk about training your 1 rep max. How often should you test it? Should you test it? Man, this is something we love talking about because, it's always fun being strong. It's fun moving heavy things. Sometimes I'll get the Forrest Gump voice on. I'll say I'm not a smart man, but I do love to lift heavy things, I just enjoy doing those things. It's fun to train. It's fun to see where you can get. It's not just for performance, but it's also, especially for a lot of men, it's just it's an ego boost, But for the sake of performance, we want to focus in on should you do it, especially across your age and everything. How often should you do it, and the implications of training and stuff. But before we dive into this, man, if you guys really want to get into training, if you really want to have some personal guidance, if you want to have some quality coaches behind you actually helping you move better, helping you see the progression, have a progressive program, then we'd love to serve you. We're really excited about our programs, about our early lifting programs, about our general programs that we have for individuals, even our body weight programs. And also if you want nutrition guidance as well, we really try to hammer the nutrition lifestyle because that supports every bit of training that we do, which is why even in our services that we offer, typically we have nutrition as a base. And if you want training on top of that, then you can add that on top of it. But check us out at LinnFit.com or message us on social media at caleb.linnfit or at LinnFit Coaching. So let's dive into this podcast.
Yeah, I'm definitely of the persuasion that we should be testing our 1RMs if we as long as we can do it safely. But I think for a lot of people, it's how quickly can actually see progress, right? I don't want to be testing this every single week because it's probably going to be the same, or maybe even sometimes it'll go down just because you had a bad night's sleep or something. So how quickly can people actually see strength gains when they're training?
Dude, that really depends. Depends on your training age. And that's basically how high skill you are, how long you've been training. Because if you've been training and actually following a really good quality program for a long time, then you're going to, especially if you've been following sort of a same program, you haven't been switching it up or trying different things, giving your body different challenges, you're going to hit sort of a peak. You're going to hit a point when you've hit a higher training age where you're not going to get that many gains very often.
Right.
But if you're an absolute beginner, you could get a new 1 rep max every 3 weeks, because you're just getting all of these gains really fast. So if you take someone who is either detrained or untrained, you can, in the first 2 to 4 weeks, that's mostly neurological adaptation. So what that means is your body's basically learning how to recruit your muscles to do the work. And so that's why you can get significant strength gains, because you're learning how to do the movement, you're learning how to get efficient at it, and your body's just getting better at recruiting the individual little tiny muscle fibers, more efficient at doing that. And so you may not get any sort of muscular change at all in those first 2 to 4 weeks, but your body is getting more efficient at using what's already there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the actual muscle gain, if you're talking about hypertrophy or taking, having muscular adaptation, that's going to take more 8 to 12 weeks in a particular cycle. And it has to be well thought out, planned out to actually get some progress. And so if you're a lower training age, really any training is going to help you. If you're untrained, any training is going to help you. The more organized, the better. If you're a higher training age, you're going to have to commit to the 8 to 12 week programs, these long training cycles that kind of, they go up and down. They give you lots of opportunities to allow your body to recover because you just put more mileage on your body and you got to work harder and have a little bit more of a well-designed program to help you actually get some new gains.
Right. Yes, we see a lot of people recommending 6 to 12 week programs, somewhere in there. Would 12 kind of be the maximum, even for someone that is pretty well trained? They've been around, they've trained for quite a while. Is 12 still kind of that maximum for most people, you'd say?
Usually, because 12 weeks is kind of the point where one, it's it's hard to commit to much more than that before you really need something different, like as an individual. But also like your body needs different challenges. It needs different movement patterns. It needs something to stimulate further growth and development or maintenance of whatever performance you're trying to maintain. And so typically you don't see programs that go beyond 12 weeks.
Okay. Yeah, so like say we're in like the middle of one of those 12-week cycles or just any cycle really, and you miss maybe a week or two. Maybe you're a little weaker, maybe you didn't train as much for that time. Would you recommend somebody to come back and would they test their some maxes again to see where they're at? Would they kind of jump right back into the same training program? Should they restart it altogether? There are a lot of different options there.
Yeah.
So
that's a good question. I mean, if you just missed a week or two in the middle of a progressive program that, let's say for example, you're doing like a Windler 5-3-1 cycle. Okay. So like week 1, you have a specific lift you're trying to get stronger in. You're doing 5 reps on that specific lift in week 1. Week 2, you're doing 3. Week 3, you're going to work up to a heavy 1 rep. And then you're going to have a deload week and you're going to start over again,
right.
Until you just keep building this up. And that's a very basic one, but a lot of, even especially someone who's younger or untrained or lower training age, they're going to get tons of benefit from a basic program like that, 5-3-1. But if you happen to miss a couple weeks in there, I'll probably scale back a little bit, scale back 10% of what you were doing as far as the weights. And then I wouldn't necessarily test it, especially if you're not ready for that. If you're coming off a vacation or something, your body's just not ready to handle a load, especially if you're trying to increase load. Usually you kind of, there's a reason that you have sort of a onboarding portion of a program. You don't break someone in week 1 usually. You kind of get them into the program. Their body goes through an adaptation phase where it's like you're extra sore in week 1 because of the workout volume. And then if you take a couple weeks off, you don't really lose much strength really. You retain strength for quite a while. There's even people that you can take a few months off and you're not going to lose significant amount of strength. You'll lose all of your cardiovascular conditioning, but you're not going to lose much strength. And so what I would recommend is actually just to help yourself mentally get back into the program. You might work up to a heavy 3 rep to just get used to feeling some weight again, but then just kind of get back into your program. So you might for 1 week kind of scale it back a little bit, reduce the percentages a little bit. Let's say you get back, you're supposed to be doing 85%. You might consider doing 75 to 80%, and just if you feel good that day, totally hit the 85%, but start a little lower to make sure your body's ready to handle it.
Right. Yeah, and one thing I would say also is if you are going to take a vacation or have a busy season of life, check out our podcast on maintain your gains on vacation. We talk about the minimum requirements you can hit to help you be able to come back and really just jump right back into what you're doing. So
yeah, we just talked about that a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. So I think there's a great place for a middle ground where it comes to testing your 1 rep max. So we don't really want to be testing it every day, right? That's not going to be super beneficial for hypertrophy or building muscle, or really not really helping you build strength either. Yeah. But we don't also want to never test it. We don't want to go around and never change our max and never actually adjust our program to see where we're at. And so in a 12-week program, how often would you have someone work up to a heavy set or maybe even max? Would they just max at the end, or would they kind of work up to a heavy sets throughout the program?
There's a lot of different ways you can approach it. Some coaches like to go heavy a couple times a week, kind of find a daily max, which may not necessarily be your absolute 1 rep max, but you're just getting used to moving heavy weight. Some programs you're just hanging out at sub-maximal loads. I'm talking 90% and below. really for strength gains, you need to be working at 70% and above on a regular basis. But they don't, some programs like won't even touch that above 90% until like test week at the end of the full program. I'm more of a fan of like getting you used to, it's because I recognize the mental factor of maxing. And if you don't touch anything close to your max for 12 weeks, whenever you finally try to break that record, like it's all in your head. You're like, I haven't lifted this much in like a few months. Like, oh man, this feels heavy. And the moment you have that thought, it's just a split second. When you have that thought, like this feels heavy, like you're done, but if you go into that lift, like, oh, I've been lifting this, like I moved really close to this last week and it felt easy. I'm going to crush this today, So I'm a fan of like several times throughout a cycle to be, kind of going up and down. You kind of get closer to your max, maybe not go for an absolute 1 rep max, but you're going to get pretty close to that within a cycle. And so if it's a 12-week cycle, you can definitely test a 1 rep max. Like you kind of typically go in like 4-week cycles kind of thing. Like you'll, in a 12-week cycle, 4 times you'll sort of see where you're at, get really close to, or actually test your 1 rep max. And then if it's a shorter cycle, then you might only test it once at the end. But usually you don't start testing it. At most, you might do like you'll go off of an old number. Like let's say it's been a long time since you max, you might take that number and you take a certain percentage off of it. Usually if someone's coming to me after not testing their max, but they've been continually training, I'll just take 10% off and then see where they're at. But then I've also started using a 3 rep max a lot more often. 3 rep max or 5 rep max, because you're able to sort of estimate based on that. There's lots of, estimation tables that you can use. You can kind of get a general idea of like, okay, it's safer. It's a safer weight neurologically and for injury and everything. You're not absolutely maxing out. Working up to the 3 rep max, and then you can be like, okay, let's say he hit, let's say he hit like 200 pounds on a back squat or something like that. And then, okay, if he hit a 3 rep max on that, then he's probably going to be somewhere around, 220, 225 pounds, something like that for his 1 rep max. And so it's a little bit safer to test for that little bit higher rep max, and then go off of that for your training cycle. And if they crush that 1 rep max, awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you highlighted a lot of the problems of how often we test, right? So talking about it's like less safe if we never really reach up to that high point and then try to go for a 1 rep max. That's not going to be super helpful for us. And like you said, if a bar feels heavy when you pick it up, you've lost already. It's so you need to be working up to at least the heavy set, like you mentioned. It's a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, I feel like it also kind of depends on your lift, what you're doing. If you're trying to work what lift you're concentrating on. So for example, if you're doing just like power lifts, like a bench press, deadlift, squat, you can retest that max regularly. You can work at a pretty high percentage of that 1 rep max pretty frequently, and you can definitely so for example, if you're trying to put on muscle size and you got to drop it down to somewhere between like 60 to 75-78% ish, because you want to hit 10 to 12 reps per set. And so like doing significantly closer to your 1 rep max is impossible, right? Then once you get more into strength, where you're working more on drilling the movement and you're trying to get under some heavier weight, then that's going to be reps of 5 to 7 per set. And then whenever you're trying to really test your power and your maximum strength, then you're going to do sets of 1 to 3 at a closer percentage. That's going to be like 90% and above usually. So whenever you're wanting to train for that, like with specific lifts, like the power lifts, you can test that higher percentage more often, whereas the higher like technical lifts, like Olympic lifts, oftentimes you might be working on a higher percentage for sort of the lifts that support that, like a squat or deadlift, but especially the squat for sure, or any kind of presses or anything like that. You're working at higher percentage of those kind of foundations of that lift, and you're working at more submaximal, 70, 85% tops for those Olympic lifts, because you're trying to drill the skill so many times throughout an entire lifting cycle. And then at the end of that cycle, you'll test that 1 rep max of that Olympic lift, where you've already probably tested 1 rep max of the squat or something several times throughout the whole cycle, Olympic lifting cycle. And so with the higher skill lifts, like, you have to drill it so often at a submaximal weight that it just, like, once you add more weight to it, it doesn't necessarily feel heavy because you've been lifted super heavy in the other lifts, and you've practiced the movement patterns so much, it just happens.
Right.
So that's why it's different. Like with power lifts, like, your feet kind of stay where they're at. It's not as dynamic. You just kind of go down and up. Whereas Olympic lift is so dynamic that there's a lot more that goes into it. You gotta, like, make sure that you practice the movement pattern a ton before you really try to test a 1 rep max.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting to think about the differences between even just different lifts.
Yeah.
They have different uses for their maxes, but
yeah. So let's think about, let's say like functional fit, like CrossFit, something like that. They really encourage heavy days. And so a lot of CrossFitters are all about, like, the, just like the lay on the floor dead, sweaty, just out of breath kind of thing. And they get bored during heavy day. Like, why would a CrossFitter benefit from doing some more heavy days? Like, finding a daily 1 rep max or a daily, 3 rep max or something like that. Just like, you're not doing anything cardiovascular, you're just moving some heavy weight. Why would a CrossFitter benefit from that?
Yeah, I think a lot of CrossFitters kind of fall into the side of not testing enough, just because they go in and have that daily WOD, and it can be a great workout, but if you never test, then you're going to be missing out a little bit. I think they can get a lot of benefit from it. One, because it can just be different than the cardiovascular thing, so just a different stimulus, and that's one thing CrossFit is all about, is changing up the stimulus continuously. And I'm really against, like, some people try to train their way to a new max, right? So they'll train for significant periods of time, even further than 12 weeks, until they basically get 3 to 5 reps as, like, oh, that's, like, the most weight I've ever lifted. I think that's just kind of inefficient, because if you're trying to set, like, a training cycle, trying to set percentages based on things, having an accurate number can be really helpful, even if it's not, like, your absolute peak max. If it's closer to your max, then you can have great percentages for yourself, and you can actually be pushing yourself through your cycle. Can help you actually continue to get stronger. If you try to train your way to a 1 rep max and you never really adjust your percentages, it can be really easy to get stuck in a rut.
Then you plateau.
Right, you can plateau and really just never go anywhere. And maybe that's why some people really don't like the heavy days. They feel like they're not going anywhere necessarily, and just kind of stuck.
Yeah. And something else that's cool about, like, lifting heavy is just, like, you get this massive neuroendocrine response. And so what does that do? That stimulates just an anabolic process. So, like, your body is ready to take up nutrients and either, lay down new tissue, recover, lay down new muscle or develop muscle, or it also just really sets the tone for your metabolism for days. Like, for example, like, every time I have a heavy deadlift day, like, I'm starving that day because my body's like, yup, give me some food, like, we're ready. And so those have a huge benefit to your overall training because you're getting that massive neuroendocrine response. So whatever else you do the rest of the week, your body is ready to fuel that training, whatever. And so if you're putting good fuel into your body, then your body's going to take it up. It's ready. And so that's why, like, oftentimes you'll work, like, larger muscle groups at the start of the week, because that can really set the tone for the rest of the week for your body, the way that it's hormonally handling it. And so that's why, like, those heavy days can be super crucial. But even for like endurance athletes, it's beneficial to do some resistance training. not to say that you have to do a 1 rep max, but some type of a max lift, a 3 rep, a 5 rep max, can really benefit endurance trainers also, because it's something different than what you're doing. But also, if you're stronger, really it helps your body move easier. Really, any type of exercise, like, to perform work, you have to be able to apply force in a certain direction. And if applying that force, if you're able to apply more force to make the process of moving yourself or an object easier, then you just became more efficient as a human being. And so any athlete can benefit from being stronger. And so you just have to manage with your nutrition, whether you want to get bigger or not. And so, that goes into more of the programming science. But from your experience, I want to ask you this: like, how often should you lift heavy and not get broken?
Yeah, I think it does kind of depend on the on a lot of things, of course. But I think for me, what I found is on certain lifts, I can lift heavy quite a lot and not really feel too worn down by it. So, for example, for me, one of those lifts would be bench press. I can train that relatively heavy. Pretty much every week I could have like a really heavy train session. Maybe even twice a week I could have a decently heavy train session and be all right. Yeah. But then some things like squats or deadlifts, if I tried to have multiple heavy days in a week for that, that'd be really difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, I don't work up to a 1 rep max. I try to do that every like 6 weeks if I can. If I'm in a training cycle, at least 6 weeks, potentially longer, depending on the programming. But if I go longer than 6 weeks, definitely want to have at least a few times of intentional, like peaking up above 90% somewhere. Yeah. I think this is something that Westside Barbell actually, and they're like really good at developing some really good athletes, really, really strong athletes. They usually they're hanging out at pretty heavy on a regular basis, but they don't go at a maximal effort more than twice a week. Really, they really try to separate those maximal efforts 3 days apart at least. And so that's something good for any of you listening to this to remember, because a maximal effort, whether it's a 1 rep max or it's like a 10 rep max, you went as heavy as you could for 10 minutes, you feel busted up afterwards. It's because it's really neurologically demanding. And so neurologically demanding means that if you try to go heavy the next couple days after that, you just don't have the same juice. You're just like, oh man, I just feel tired. I don't have the same motivation. It's because literally your nervous system, which is responsible for recruiting those muscles to move that weight, is taxed and needs a break. And so this is where people can get, run the risk of overtraining if they try to lift too heavy too often. And so usually for me, I try to separate any kind of heavy, really, really heavy maximal efforts, 3 days apart. And so that allows me to not feel broken all the time, not ache. And definitely I'm getting older. And so that happens, so I have to really manage my mobility, my recovery really, really well. But generally, if I separate those really heavy maximal efforts by 3 days, I feel pretty good. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the benefits of maxing too, is if you kind of program in a deload, or just like a little bit of time where your volume may be decreased, you can actually feel really great after that.
Yeah.
You get to see okay, all that training has kind of come down to this point in time. And I think just training in general, you get to see your progress. You get to work hard for weeks and months potentially, and get to see your progress. I think it's a lot of life lessons behind that. And that definitely part of the reason I love to test my 1 rep max is get to recover a little bit and get to see all the hard work that I've done pay off.
Yeah. And you might consider certain times in the year, or, if you have too much stress going on outside of the gym, or your nutrition's whack, or you've been, you're traveling a lot, then it might not make sense to do a lot of heavy lifting, because if you already have a lot of stress going on in your life, that really, really heavy day might do more harm than good. And so that's whenever you might say, like, okay, instead of doing a 1 rep max, I'll work up to a 3 rep max because it's not quite as demanding on me. But we definitely know that, regardless, like moving some weight can make you feel better, And so, but just consider in the grand scheme of everything that's going on in your life, like, should you be testing a 1 rep max this week, And sometimes that's what's hard for people. It's hard to commit to this whole cycle because, life happens. Like, oh, it's test week. Oh man, like I also have this other stuff going on. I'm not getting enough sleep. And so don't feel bad if you don't break your 1 rep max record. Especially as you get to a higher training age, like those 1 rep max, a new 1 rep max record doesn't come very often. Like for me, it's like maybe once a year or once every couple of years, And so it comes few and far between. So you find other ways to develop your skill and find other, personal bests that you can find.
Don't act like you're that old. Come on.
Yeah. So, this is a good conversation. We're even doing like a squat cycle right now because I have I am recognizing my own personal weaknesses, and we're like, all right, we gotta get stronger at squat if you want to get a new squat clean PR, because my power clean is like my posterior chain is way stronger than my squat. So working on the technique and drilling the technique at lighter weights. So like we're moving really heavy squats while we're also doing a little bit lighter percentage on our Olympic lifts, so that we can really drill the techniques, and when we're ready to test, we're gonna crush it.
Mm-hmm.
So looking forward to that. But thanks for listening in today, guys. This was fun talking about it. I hope this gave you some clarity on, lifting heavy, and how often you should do it and how you can commit to that, the benefits of it. We want to empower you guys with everything we're putting out on this podcast. And so I hope this was beneficial for you today. We'll catch you guys on the next one.